What do Khabib Nurmagomedov, Islam Makhachev, Khamzat Chimaev, Shavkat Rakhmonov, Rafael Fiziev, Sharabulit, and many other high-profile fighters have in common? That a casual MMA fan from the West will simply say that they're crazy Russians, and he would be wrong. For the most part. We will explore why most of these fighters aren't Russian, or French, or German, or British, or Spanish for that matter, and why it is hypocritical to call them that. To fully explore this topic, we would first have to definitively establish what is a Russian. Majority of the difficulty of comprehension in the Western world stems from the fact that while there are two words in Russian that can describe one's identity, the first being Rossianin, which simply denotes as one being a citizen of Russia. Under this definition, you and I can become Russian as well by simply moving there and getting a passport. The second term is Ruski, denoting someone of Russian Slavic ethnicity. Ethnic Slavic Russians make up around 75 to 80% of the population of the Russian Federation, and traditionally, this was the identity that Westerners understood Russians as in the days of the Cold War. Think Ivan Drago, bears unicycling while drinking vodka, thick accents with short laconic speech, Orthodox Christian or atheist identity. This is what more closely resembles the Western stereotypes of Russians in the past. Now that we have established the terms Rossianin and Ruski, we will separate these fighters into three different groups and evaluate their quote-unquote Russianness. First group of fighters. This is the easiest group to evaluate. These are fighters that aren't ethnic Russians and aren't even from Russia. Their only tie to Russia is that at one point they may have been conquered by the Russian Empire, which then transformed into the Soviet Union. Reminder to not take the word Union and Soviet Union literally and assume that these nations joined willingly and weren't persuaded to join with the help of Stalin's firing squads. This criterion includes fighters like Shavkat Rakhmonov, Georgian fighters like Merab Dvalishvili, Giga Chikadze, Rafael Fiziev. These fighters are in no way, shape or form Russian and shouldn't be identified as that. That would be the equivalent of calling Indian fighters English or calling Moroccan fighters French because at one point in time these countries were colonized by the latter. So, no Eddie Bravo. Shavkat isn't a
Chinese-looking Russian, Shavkat.
Oh, Shavkat Rakhmonov.
He's a Turkic Kazakh Muslim from Kazakhstan who barely even speaks Russian and conducts his interviews mostly in Kazakh.
Қайтыс болған кісілердің туысқандарына соболезнования білдіремін. Сол.
Now the Georgian fighters seem to have been able to avoid this fate as their last names do not usually have ov or ish at the end. And possibly due to a military conflict with Russia in 2008, many people see the difference. However, it is laughable when fans of MMA fighters from Russia get hurt over Merab's comments about Petryan being a Russian bully and respond with Habib, Umar would smoke you, not knowing that ethnically, Georgians are North Caucasians as well and have many more ties, cultural similarities and customs to Dagestanis, Chechnyans, and English than ethnic Russians do. And Georgia is the only independent country that is the closest to North Caucasus republics within Russia, identity-wise. Final point that I would make is that a Western MMA fan may see an OV and assume someone is Russian, not knowing that OV just means of, and was added to many ethnic minorities in former Soviet Union in documents unwillingly. Assuming that someone is Russian due to their last name ending in ov or ish is equivalent to assuming that someone named Habib Onormagomed or Habib Maknormagomed must be Irish. Many non-Russians are beginning to change this practice and adjust their last names accordingly. A newcomer from Kazakhstan to UFC is named Azat Maksum, with the ov being correctly removed. So this group of fighters is the easiest to evaluate by far, and they are not Russian at all. Moving on. Ethnic minorities from the Russian Federation. Now this group of fighters is where things get tricky, and we will focus the majority of this video on this group of fighters. Fighters who aren't ethnically Russian, but hail from autonomous republics within Russia, like Puerto Rico and Samoa's relationship to USA. Majority of these fighters hail from the North Caucasus region, mostly from the Republic of Dagestan, with others being from the other republics such as Chechnya, Ingustia, Kabardino-Balkaria, and etc. One of the retorts that I've heard frequently is that how come Khabib's team speaks Russian to each other if they aren't ethnically Russian? There are three elements as to why this argument is wrong. Dagestan is an autonomous republic within Russian Federation, which is home to over 40 ethnicities, with most ethnicities being neither of native Caucasus stock or of Turkic origin. While Turkic ethnicities have a degree of mutual intelligibility, the native languages of Caucasus are extremely different from one another, and usually aren't mutually intelligible. Therefore, Russian is used as a lingua franca when the Dagestanis of different ethnicities congregate. And that's the case with Khabib's team, which has ethnic Avars, Laks, Lezgins, and etc. Secondly, any native Russian speaker will tell you that Khabib and his team have thick accents in Russian, and their speech in Russian is just as comical in English as it is in Russian to a native speaker. Finally, even if they didn't have or know their language, that doesn't suddenly erase their identity. Many Irish people today do not know their language, yet no one denies them their identity and calls them English. This region from the beginning resisted Russian occupation and noted their cultural differences from that of Russians. Figures like Imam Shamil and Weisinger come to mind as they put up a fierce but unsuccessful resistance to Russian occupation. Due to many Americans seeing things through racial lenses, they simply see that a Russian looks white, a Dagestani looks white, therefore the Dagestanis are ethnic Russians. However, ethnicities of Dagestan as mentioned are not Slavic, they are of Turkic and native Caucasus stock. Genetically, Y-DNA haplogroups of Dagestanis and ethnic Russians are completely different. There was also minimal intermarriage between the two groups. Ethnic tensions between Russians and people from the Caucasus used to be very high and still exist. There are many Russian slurs that are used against North Caucasians such as Tat, Cherka, and Chernozovai. It is perplexing to see Russian immigrants in the West claim everyone as Russian, when anyone from Russia knows these simple things. One guess as to why they do that is because they can then create an image of being tough mountain warriors with world-level fighting abilities for themselves without actually having anything to do with North Caucasians. This absurdity goes as far as these immigrant content creators making skits where they simply misrepresent Dagestanis and Chechnans as South Russians. It should also be noted that within Russia, whenever these fighters win, the news media in Russia describes them as Russian. However, shall they fail, they immediately get labeled as Dagestani or Chechnya. Sometimes, a news outlet will use this logic in the same exact event, properly identifying the losing fighter from the Caucasus, but suddenly catching amnesia and identifying the winning fighter as Russian. Although we will come back to this later, it should also be noted that Dagestani fighters that were able to emigrate to Europe and fight out of Europe never present themselves as Russian, only as their ethnicity and their newly found country of citizenship. Mohammed Makav even went as far as requesting that UFC removes Russia from the infographics pertaining to him, and only lists Dagestan and/or United Kingdom. We all know that Russia isn't exactly famous for their human rights observance and freedom of speech, so we can deduce that Dagestani fighters with Russian citizenship can only say so much of what's on their mind. Next, let's turn to fighters of Chechnya descent. This is even more of a controversial take to call them Russian, as Chechyans fought twice for their independence in the 90s and early 2000s, and many lost their family members and/or became refugees due to this conflict. There is also additional history of Soviet Union deporting Chechyans from their homeland. This is why you will never hear Khamzat represent or praise Russia. In the famous clip, he goes, "This is Chechnya." Ethnic minorities from the Caucasus vastly overrepresent Russian presence in the MMA, while barely comprising 10% of the population of the Russian Federation. Sure, there are ethnic Russian fighters such as Pitryan, Roman Kopylov, Sergei Pavlovich, but interestingly, all three have close ties to the Caucasus and train there. A perfect comparison would be what Puerto Rico and Samoa are to USA. Both are American territories, but semi-autonomous, and with a huge ethnic and cultural difference to the mainland USA. Many Americans themselves easily identify and differentiate Puerto Ricans and Samoans, yet struggle to do so with fighters from the Caucasus. If suddenly most of the top-level American fighters were exclusively from Puerto Rico, this phenomenon would be identified and pointed out. Hence why I'm aiming to point this out when it comes to Russian fighters. In conclusion, this group of fighters is Russian in terms of their citizenship, but are quite distinct from the mainstream Russian society, and shouldn't be mixed in with the stereotypes of the said mainstream Russian society. And considering their low proportion in relation to population of Russia, but their prevalence at the top of the MMA world, this phenomenon should be pointed out and studied. Now lastly, we will touch on ethnic minorities from Russian Federation who emigrated to Europe and fight out of Europe. There was also a sentiment once again to suppress their Caucasus identity and just call them French, British, Spanish, or Swedish. Sean Strickland commented on how we will be fighting a German, Abbas Magomedov. Scores of casuals in the comment sections will call Ilia Topuria a Spaniard and not Georgian in terms of ethnic origin, and Imavov French. Yet the same fans will never do that to ethnic African fighters in the same exact predicament, and will always identify and remember their ethnic origins. Israel Adesanya isn't dismissed as a New Zealander Kiwi when he speaks on his Nigerian Yoruba heritage. Francis Ngannou rarely ever gets called Frenchman when he came up in France, and was teammates with Nasruddin Imavov, who gets called French and not Kumik Dagestani. And no one questions Kamaru Usman's Nigerio-Edo identity either, despite Kamaru Usman being an American citizen and at this point having spent majority of his life in the USA. This is probably the American tendency of seeing things through a racial lens kicking in, while downplaying what they perceive to be a white fighter's foreignness. Khamzat Chimaev still gets called Russian despite being of Chechen ethnicity and now having Swedish citizenship, effectively cutting all and any ties to a Russian identity. This group, just like the first one, should not be categorized as Russian at all, as their ethnic origin isn't Russian, and since they've made sure to adopt citizenship of another country. If Israel Adesanya doesn't have to choose between being Yoruba and Kiwi, then Khamzat Chimaev shouldn't have to choose between being Chechen and Swedish. If Francis Ngannou doesn't have to choose between being Cameroonian and French, then Nasruddin Imavov shouldn't have to choose between being Kumik Dagestani and French. If Kamaru Usman doesn't have to choose between being Nigerian Edo and American, then Ilia Topuria shouldn't have to choose between being Georgian and Spanish.